Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Screening and Supporting Students, a Tisch College webinar on the new Massachusetts Dyslexia Guidelines with Leandra Elion and Melissa Orkin. I'm starting slowly because of the very large number of people who are joining the webinar, 270 so far, and we're just very proud to welcome so many educators, parents, advocates, and Tufts community members to this special webinar. I think the degree of interest was actually surprising and very encouraging. My name is Peter Levine. I am an associate dean and a professor at the Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts University. And let me say a few words about why Tisch College is relevant and why, in fact, we're hosting this morning's session. Melissa and Leandra, you'll hear a little bit more about in a minute. I'm going to summarize their bios, but they're very busy. And one of their activities that they're doing along with the dyslexia work is a special program that they created and they now run called Literacy in Action. And it's a service learning program. So they educate Tufts students in credit-bearing courses to directly work with children, K-3 children in Medford and Somerville, our host communities, on early literacy. And this program is funded by the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, DESE, as part, I think, of the response to the pandemic and the education crisis caused by the pandemic. But it's part of our mission at Tisch College, where we are involved with civic engagement and community service and civic education for our students, as well as benefits for the community. So we're the platform for that. Ariel Apito, another Tisch College staff member, is very much involved, and we're proud to host that, and that's why we have made a space for today's webinar. But so today our focus is not on that. It's on, although I think you could ask questions about that if you want, but it's on the dyslexia guidelines, the state dyslexia guidelines, and we do have the two best people available here to talk to us about those guidelines. So let me say a few words about them. Two friends of mine as well. So Melissa Orkin is a developmental psychologist who specializes in learning disabilities and reading instruction, and in particular dyslexia. Dr. Orkin, Melissa, trained in the assessment and remediation of reading and learning disabilities here at Tufts at our Center for Reading and Language Research, where she received her doctorate, and she directed the program. She's worked as a reading teacher in the classroom and in clinical settings. She teaches reading instruction and learning disabilities here at Tufts. She publishes widely, and she regularly provides professional development and consults with schools and the public on best practices. Leandra Elion is a reading specialist and a special education teacher. She has training and expertise in multi-sensory methods for students with dyslexia. She's taught literacy to students of all ages, from preschoolers through elementary, right up to high school. She's also taught teacher interns here at Tufts and at Brandeis. She's been a literacy coordinator for public school districts, and she has worked for DESE, for the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, in their Special Education Planning and Policy Department. Right now, she's the president-elect of the Massachusetts Reading Association, working on international and statewide literacy improvement projects. So Melissa and Leandra worked in collaboration with stakeholders across Massachusetts and representatives from DESE to develop the Massachusetts Dyslexia Guidelines. What's going to happen now, I'm going to get out of the way in just a couple minutes. We're going to have a conversation really led by Melissa and Leandra. They have a presentation and there'll be discussion. There'll be time for questions and answers at the end. And you can type I think you'll get more instructions about this in the chat, but from our colleague Shanley, but you can type your questions in the Q&A box and they'll get addressed at the end. And I'm going to kind of kick it off with one question, really, and then after that, I'll leave it to my two friends and colleagues. My question is, Melissa and Leandra, why were these guidelines created and why now? Thank you for doing this with us.
Sure. Yeah, good morning. Thank you, Peter. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us on this beautiful Tuesday morning in July. We're really honored that you're taking time out of a precious, gorgeous day to spend time with us. And so Leandra and I are going to be sharing some of our insights and highlights about creating guidelines. So this initial question that Peter asked, why, why is there another policy coming out? Why now? I think that new policies can generate mixed emotions among stakeholders. Sometimes it can feel like just another thing that needs to be done. So we're going to be providing a bit of a context for the reason that these guidelines were developed, and also highlight some of the key features. As Peter said, Leandra and I were contributing authors to the guidelines, so we can give you a little bit of the background and a little bit of the rationale for different aspects of the guidance. So we've prepared some slides, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, but as Peter mentioned, you can put any questions that you have you can use the Q&A box. So this is a webinar style Zoom. I'm more accustomed to like a meeting style where you're just putting questions in the chat, but you can just put questions in the Q&A box. And Leandra and I will definitely leave time at the end. Leandra, you'll help keep us on track maybe.
I'll try. I'll certainly try. There is a lot to cover, so we're going to do our best.
Yeah, we'll do our best and keep it fun and light and interesting. Folks from the Tisch College are also going to put some additional resources in the chat. We're going to be referring pretty frequently to the guidelines because we really want you to see this as, if you're a practitioner, an educator, an administrator, we want you to see this as a resource for your work. If you're a parent or a community member and you have questions about the science behind reading and dyslexia, we want you to also see this as a resource for your questions as well. All right, so let me go ahead by sharing my screen, and we'll start.
While Melissa's getting that ready, I will just say that the work on the guidelines, while Melissa and I were, really intimately involved in writing much of it, it was a real collaborative work by the Department of Education and the Department of Early Education and Care. And when you go to the guidelines, you'll see that there were many stakeholders across the state who were involved in this. So it's really a very collaborative document.
Yeah, and we were so grateful for all the insights of stakeholders that took part in the focus group meetings and reviewed drafts and all of that. Okay, great. So here's what the guidelines look like. And Peter's question, well, why do we have the guidelines? So there are really two main reasons why the guidelines for supporting the needs of students with dyslexia and also screening for risk of reading challenges have come out. The first reason is the science, and the second reason is about equity. And when the two of these get together and go on a date, we get practices that really transform educational experiences for children and achievement for students. So I'm just going to talk briefly about the science. Before I even go through these bullet points, I think the first thing that you should know as an educator, if you're in your mind thinking, oh my gosh, there is always something new coming out, especially about reading instruction. Every time I turn around, there's a new strategy. Well, reading is the most studied aspect of learning, and there are multiple millions of dollars spent every year on trying to better understand how the reading process happens in children and adolescents, because reading is not natural. We're not born being able to read. So a lot of this work, especially over the last 20 years, has focused on determining how early you can identify children who are vulnerable to struggling with the process of learning to read. And what we found is that, and this is largely through some of the neuroimaging research that's been done here in Massachusetts by Nadine Gaab and John Gabrielli and others around the country and around the world, we've found that risk factors can be detected prior to formal reading instruction. So even before kids are taught to read, there are ways in which they process sounds, they name objects that can lead to some vulnerabilities in reading achievement. In fact, neuroimaging has identified what's called a neural signature, or like a particular brain activation pattern among these at-risk students. And there are several key areas where we see less activation as compared to children who achieve normally or typically in reading. Processing sounds, as I said, retrieving linguistic information, so something like looking at a picture of a chair or a star and being able to name it rapidly, and also matching up sounds and letters. So that's part of the science that's contributed to this idea of screening students early. The other piece is equity, and Leandra is going to talk a bit about this.
So a very important aspect of these guidelines and why the state has put them out now was that, there have been inconsistent practices around screening and identifying and sort of understanding the process of learning to read. So with these guidelines, we have this document that provides consistent practices, no matter what school district a child is in. It sort of reinforces and strengthens those child find requirements that have always existed, to identify children who might be at risk of learning disabilities and a whole range of other disabilities. But these guidelines add clarity to districts. It provides a common understanding. So, once again, no matter what school a child attends throughout the Commonwealth, these are the expectations that will be in place, and a common set of screening tools that are really validated and research-based. So not just something that one particular school district does and another school district does something else, and then there is no real basis for comparison. And as Melissa pointed out, the guidelines look at what the research and what the science has shown as to be the most predictive tasks. So, you're not wasting your time on screening children on tasks that are not predictive. And it's a way that all children get screened on the most predictive tasks. So it's not just about screening, as we're going to talk to you during this webinar. We're not just focused on the screening and then that's it. It's what the screening does, how the screening leads to targeted instructions and leads to what we call the preventative approach. So, more is on the guidelines on page 19, and we encourage you to actually print out a copy of the guidelines for yourself, because there are so many references, so many sections that you are going to want to flag and target yourselves to use to provide this equity for all your students.
So as Leandra mentioned, the guidelines are not just about screening, although screening is what has been kind of the common question that we get. It's really about the entire MTSS model, the multi-tiered systems of support. So that includes what we're screening students for, how predictive it is, how that data is interpreted through data team meetings, how the data that you receive helps you formulate intervention that's targeted towards weaknesses for your students and appropriately differentiated, and then how you're able to progress monitor those students who require supplemental instruction, so something in addition to the core. And then for some students, it might also involve referral for eligibility testing for special education. You see this arrow going back and forth between targeted intervention and progress monitoring. And that's because it's an iterative cycle. You're collecting information, you're monitoring students' progress, and that's informing the nature of your intervention, the intensity of your intervention, what you're focusing on, all of that. All right, so we decided to structure the rest of this talk as like a conversation between Leandra and I. So in our time that we're not at Tufts, We have a small consulting practice called Crafting Minds, and Leandra and I are no longer in school settings. We're not teaching anymore, so we don't have the privilege of being in front of children and adolescents every day. Instead, we are in front of journals and and articles, and we're immersing ourselves in the research and working to translate that research into practice. So that's what we thought we would do is kind of share the most common questions we're getting from educators and take the research and help translate it into practices for instruction and assessment. Okay.
So, you know, we do have the privilege of working with educators. So that is a real joy for us to work with a range of educators across the state. And, you know, these educators are our colleagues, our friends, and we've had many questions from them. So I'll just start by sharing one of the questions that I've heard many, many times, and I'm sure you've heard this too, that, oh my goodness, you know, you're asking me to screen kindergartners. Isn't that just so aggressive that as soon as these little kindergartners come into the classroom with their lovely shiny faces and their bright backpacks, and then you want to screen them? Aren't you being too aggressive, Melissa?
So that's a very good question. So one of the reasons that we focus so much on early screening, and the reason the screening piece of the guidelines is focused on kindergarten through second grade, is because of what the research has to say about effective intervention. So when we're talking about intervention, we're talking about something in addition to core or classroom instruction. So it could be something like tier 2 intervention that's delivered within the general kind of education. It could be tier 3 intervention, which also can be delivered within general education, but is usually thought of as more specialized. We'll talk about that. Or it could be intervention that is being delivered to a child who is eligible for special education. But overall, what the research says is that when you give students 100 hours of targeted intervention, in this research study, which had different elements embedded into the intervention, it brought the majority of at-risk first graders, so first graders who were screened and determined to be at risk on the screening, 100 hours of intervention brought them into the average range of reading ability. But the same impact is not observed in third grade students. And it really has to do with kind of the gap that emerges between good readers and poor readers very quickly throughout reading instruction. So the preventative approach to reading failure is the most effective approach. Interventions, by and large, have been found to be the most effective between ages 6 to 8. Now, I don't want to by any means imply that intervention, that a child cannot be successful if they're older than third grade. It is true that we see growth. It just takes significantly more time and intensity and focus than one, set of 100-hour intervention has been effective with younger students.
Okay, so, we know we have to do the screening, and who's going to do it? The teachers have got so much to do. So, when we think of assessments, we usually think in terms of the special ed, because special educators are really skilled at administering assessments. So who can administer these assessments? Is it just for special education teachers, or, I'm a reading teacher, will I be involved?
Yeah. So this is a question that we also field frequently. And I think part of it is because this guidance came out of the Department of Special Education. So there's the idea that this is a special education document, but really this is a entire education document. And when we think about a screening team, this is all on page 24 of the guidance. It really, stipulates that the screening team should have members that represent different aspects of the educational process, including general educators, administrators, instructional experts in reading instruction. So that might be reading specialists or special educators, school psychologists, teachers of English language development or English as a second language, because everyone's bringing their own knowledge and expertise to the team.
Another member of the team that I don't see listed here, but people who can play such an important role are speech and language pathologists.
Oh, you're right.
You know, I would really like to encourage districts to include their speech and language pathologists on the team, because they have a really skilled understanding of, you know, how we acquire language, both written and oral.
Yeah, thanks for making that point, Leandra.
Okay, so now I know I'm screening, but you know, is it the same as identifying a student for, you know, with dyslexia? What is the difference between screening and identification? I'm confused.
Okay, so before we go into this, I just want to point to chapter 3 in the guidelines. So this is a great place in the guidelines where there's a nice kind of differentiation between what screening is and what identification, and it goes into, again, more of the kind of background around screening. But in general, screening is designed to be a very brief process. So it should be less than 30 minutes per student. It should measure predictive skills for reading at each grade level, K to 2, at different time points. It's administered multiple times throughout the year. And one of the reasons this is because reading is a very dynamic process within the first several years of education, really throughout elementary school, but certainly K to 2. Reading is a very dynamic process. Reading skills are changing and the criterion is changing. What we expect from students changes from, think of September in first grade to January in mid-year. It should be, the screening tool should be normed or criterion based. So that means that there's some statistical analysis that has gone into the development of this tool, and it can, through this analysis, determine who is at risk based on their performance on these quick measures of predictive reading skills. So who is at risk based on their ability to segment sounds, phoneme segmentation, break apart the sounds in words. Who's at risk based on their ability to decode a set of words in 1 minute, basically. That's the statistical analysis that the publishers have done. And it should then tell you how many students in your class or in your grade or in your school demonstrate little or no risk, to some risk, to significant risk. And sometimes those are color-coded, green, yellow, red. It should be a valid tool, valid and reliable. And most importantly, I think at the bottom, there's one other one we're going to talk about, but it really should be something that anybody at the school, from a teacher to a reading specialist to a principal, could, with some, training, interpret. Like, you could run a report, you could see easily who is at risk, in what areas, and how I'm going to support them. And then it's really beneficial if this screening tool is also connected to your progress monitoring, because it's just kind of this seamless process where you're screening them on certain tasks, and then you're able to provide them with intervention if need be, and monitor how the student is developing skills.
So I think it sort of speaks to the point of, that reticence of like, oh, maybe I'm not able to do the screening, I'm not trained, but these tasks are supposed to be quick and easy to administer. So really that any person who works with early elementary school children should be able to administer these. Okay, so so we know what they should look like, the overall big picture, but exactly what skills am I looking for? You mentioned segmenting sounds, Melissa, but what else?
Yeah, well, I guess I didn't fully answer your question though, Leandra. I told you kind of what characterizes the screening, but So a screening is not eligibility testing. Where we said screening is short, eligibility testing is comprehensive. It is using standardized assessments. It involves a team. It's much more involved than just a quick screening, which tells you a level of risk for a student. Eligibility testing is really determining whether or not a student meets the kind of elaborate criteria for a specific learning disability in reading in this case. Okay, so what skills should we be measuring in the screening and when should we do it? So each of the grade levels that are involved in the screening guidelines, this is just for screening, kindergarten, first and second grade, have their own chart, like the one that you see here, which tells you which skills are the most predictive and how you measure those skills at different time points. So for example, this is kindergarten. What you'll notice here is that the screening for kindergarten is only, the guidelines only recommend it twice for the year. And that's different than first and second, where it's 3 times. So screening should occur in kindergarten by the end of December. And then again at the end of the school year. So for example, with alphabetic knowledge in kindergarten, you know, your first screening task is something like letter identification, tell me the name of this letter, or letter sound knowledge. But by the end of the year, you want to measure letter sound knowledge and decoding, which is the ability in which students have to blend the sounds together to sound out usually a nonsense word. So the tasks will change over the course of the year. And you'll see that for not only kindergarten, but also first grade, second grade, and second grade. Sometimes you'll see that you only need to administer a task once over the course of the year. For example, down at the bottom here, rapid automatic naming, the letter naming subtest, that's only administered 1 time during the entire kindergarten year. I'm sorry, during the entire first grade year. So again, these tables are on the corresponding pages in the guidelines. We hope that you'll print the guidelines or have them accessible, that you'll highlight these different components that are relevant to your work. Okay, anything else to say about that, Leandra?
Not specifically right now. I know that you know, people have been asking some questions around the timeline for implementing the whole the guidelines as a whole, but we will get to those because some of the questions that everybody's been asking in the chat have been the questions we've been hearing too. So we've prepared a lot of these questions in advance. We're going to keep our eye on the chat so that we make sure we get to them.
Great.
So
oh,
yeah. Well, actually, there we go.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, it's like we're psychic. Okay, so Leandra, since you brought it up, when should schools put these guidelines into place, and what happens if a school doesn't have a particular screener? Like the one that we're hearing most commonly about is RAN, because rapid automatic naming is relatively new to some districts, and they might not have a tool that includes a measure of RAN. So tell me what you're thinking about that.
So what I want to say is that, and I alluded to this before, is that, you know, schools have always had this mandate and this requirement to be screening students and to be assessing the students who come in. And I think we all, you know, if you've been a parent and if you're involved in the education system, there's usually, you know, some kind of kindergarten orientation where they do a screening. Where, you know, they sort of introduce the kids to the school and they're giving them some tasks to do. And sometimes they are, you know, how the children draw or color in or do some fine motor or gross motor activities. And these are great because these fall under what is known as child find. Both IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is a federal law, and Massachusetts law spell out how districts should be proactive in identifying students. So in effect, you know, districts should be screening all the time, but what these guidelines do is really help districts refine their practice about screening for these literacy skills and give guidance to districts about what they could be doing, like take a good stock of what they're currently doing and make sure that their protocols are the most predictive of reading ability and are the most sort of up to date with what the science has taught us. And I will also say that it's not just the science from one study, it's the science that is sort of being convergent from many research studies that talk about what skills should we assess that are most predictive. And so districts should be doing the screening. The guidelines help them do it even better.
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't have a RAN in the fall, you should be working to get one pretty soon, because the science has shown that RAN is one of the most predictive, quick, easy assessments that you can do to help guide your instruction for the students. So of course, you know, you're going to get this range of students who come in that you have to screen, and you are going to have in many districts emergent bilinguals, you know, the English language learners. So Melissa, what do we do about those students? Are they part of the screening?
Yeah, so there is an entire chapter in the guidelines that's dedicated to considerations for emergent bilinguals, and you know, it really starts by talking about the value of bilingualism and the importance of honoring home languages in the learning process. And then it goes on to talk about, you know, how to incorporate, again, some of the tasks that are cognitive predictors of reading that often are not language dependent, as effective tools, especially for children who may have less experience with English, but also including measures of reading ability as soon as it seems appropriate, and whenever possible, assessing a student in their home language. I know that a lot of assessments are now making tasks available, especially in Spanish. But the key idea here is that there shouldn't be a waiting period until students are proficient in English to screen for vulnerabilities. That, you know, as soon as possible, we want to identify any areas of, you know, prominent weakness that are happening. And some additional information is really helpful to clarify those areas of weakness. So thinking about the level of English proficiency that's been achieved by a student, and whether, you know, the oral proficiency seems to be aligned with the written language proficiency. Are difficulties present, as I said, in native language and in English? Does the student experience any delays in learning to talk, or have they had interruptions in their educational experience? What has been their response to intervention? Have they had some sort of structured reading instruction, which is a term that's been widely used now to really describe kind of explicit, systematic, multisensory instruction that builds skills in an incremental way. And then, of course, you know, how are their cognitive functions developing? And two key warning signs that are featured in the chapter on emergent bilinguals are that students continue to experience persistent difficulties acquiring new language differences. So being able to discriminate or segment sounds, phonemes that are new to them, they're not consistent with their native language, even though they've had strong intervention, or that they seem to be having more difficulties than their peers who have had, or coming from similar language backgrounds and who've been in the United States educational system for a similar amount of time. So these are some considerations to think about. It is a complex issue. There's no doubt about it. It is not as straightforward as children who are proficient in English in terms of screening, but it doesn't mean that we want to not screen them. We want to continue to screen and take these additional considerations to the team as we're thinking about what our students need.
Okay, so here's, I think, the heart of the questions that have been popping up. So are there, or is there an approved dyslexia screener from DESI? And the answer is actually no, yes and no, no. But really, I want you to sort of take away that there is no list of approved dyslexia screeners that DESI has put out in the guidelines. However, rather than endorsing like one single tool, like, oh, you know, you should use the ABC screener, the guidelines list the essential components of a screening protocol across the grades. So referring back to those slides that Melissa had a little earlier of what is done, you know, in kindergarten, first and second grade, and the particular skills that should be done at the various intervals. So there are these guidelines about what they should look like. Now, I think where a lot of the confusion comes in is that, you know, DESI has different units working on very similar topics, and the literacy unit, the ELA and the humanities unit have come out with a list of early literacy approved screening assessments, just for early literacy skills in general, not for indicating, you know, the risk or the signs of dyslexia. And they have a list of approved screening assessments. So it is on the slide here, and I think that they've been put into the chat earlier, and we will put those back into the chat, and also definitely at the end, where you can go to find these early literacy approved screening assessments, but they're not the same as the dyslexia screenings. Now, that doesn't mean to say that they're two separate, and I hope you're all not going, oh my goodness, two different screenings to go through. They can align very, very easily, because those tasks that you're looking for in those early literacy screenings are very much the same as some of the tasks you're looking for for dyslexia screening. So do you want to give a specific example of that, Melissa, or?
Yeah, and I'll just say that link that you have down at the bottom, that early literacy approved screening assessments at a glance, that's something that they developed as like a quick sheet to look at to see which of those tasks are involved in the screening tool. And it's really, really helpful. So I highly recommend taking a look at that if you're an educator. So when we think about, you know, why are there so many different measures, and why even in the screening assessment that we were showing at kindergarten, first and second grade, why am I administering all these different tasks? Why can't I just listen to a student read a passage or listen to a student read a book? And this really connects back to what we know about the science of reading and how the reading brain develops, or the reading circuit in the brain develops. So reading, you know, happens at 3 different levels. I just have a Ricola in my cheek to keep my voice fresh and dewy. But
so I'll just say, you know, while you're doing that Ricola,
I'm trying to get this down a little bit, yeah.
So, you know, when we've done all this neuroimaging, and here's a little model of the brain, there is no one part of the brain that we can pinpoint and say, oh, this is exactly where reading occurs. You know, it's occurring by building a circuit through different lobes of the brain. And because we are having to do multiple tasks to be able to read. So it's very helpful to think that reading occurs at different levels.
Yeah, exactly. So we read, you know, we read things that connect, we read connected text, which are phrases, sentences, and passages. But in order to read connected text, we need knowledge of single words, which is called the lexical level. And then in order to read single words in connected text, we have all of these kind of foundational skills of letters and sounds and letter patterns, and that's called the sublexical level, below the level of the word. So we're reading all of these different levels of content, but then also we have different domains of skills. So we have our accuracy skills, we have our automaticity skills and retrieval, and we have our oral language knowledge. So accuracy skills refer to things like sound symbol correspondence and being able to decode accurately or recognize sight words. Automaticity is referring to kind of the fluency with which we can do these tasks. And then oral language comprehension is how we make meaning out of what we're reading. So if we take all of these different components, the three levels, connected text, lexical, and sublexical, and the three domains, accuracy, automaticity, and oral language, and we try to arrange them in a grid, what we'll see is that the different tasks that we ask students to do during a screening fall under these different categories, so that we're really trying to tap in to these different aspects of the reading circuit. For example, a phoneme segmentation task, when we ask students to tell me how many sounds are in the word hip. When we're asking them to break up the sounds in a word, that's an accuracy task, and they're doing it at the sublexical level. A rapid naming task is something that they're doing also at the sublexical level, where they're just naming letters or naming objects, but it's tapping into the automaticity domain because you're timing it. A decoding measure is an accuracy task that's happening at the lexical level. Whereas a passage reading fluency is really cutting across all of these domains. It's combining accuracy, automaticity, and oral language. You know, as we read, we're making meaning of what we're reading, and that's enhancing our fluency as well. And so what we're trying to do when we're assessing all these different levels is really try to understand where a breakdown is happening to inform our intervention.
Okay.
All right, so we're going to shift gears here a little bit. Is that clear, Leandra? Do you feel like that was a clear description?
Yeah,
okay.
and I think you come back to this, you are going to refer to this again when we're talking about how we take the data that we find and target our intervention. So,
Right.
we will return to that.
Yeah.
We did have a question in the chat that I'll bring up now. And of course, I don't think there's an easy answer to this question, but I think it's one that we are all thinking about is, when we are screening these students and we are going to get this information on their level of skill, how are we going to interpret all this sort of given these interruptions of schooling for COVID? So yeah, it's a hard question to answer, definitively, except to say, we are going to have to respond with that insight. Yeah.
I mean, I think that what we'll be talking about at the end are what are the next steps. And I think that many schools are going to be looking at, how do we account for disrupted learning over the last year and a half, and how do we do it within our classroom instruction? How do we do it within our intervention instruction? How do we do it across the grades? Do we, some districts are now looking at, oftentimes reading instruction really kind of, especially like the mechanics of reading, the word reading part, only are in kindergarten, first and second grade, sometimes third. Many districts are looking at, more substantially building out a curriculum in third grade, expanding the amount of time that students have to learn these skills. So there are a variety of different approaches. And I think that we're going to be talking about, really facing these questions in a thoughtful way, oftentimes through the development of a literacy committee, or even thinking about a strategic plan that can help address some areas that the stakeholders feel like are areas that needs to be shifted within the curriculum.
Yeah, and just before we go on to this big question, I thought about this COVID impact, is that, you know, when you are going to be doing these screenings for everybody, you are going to get a picture of the skills that your students are going to come into the school year with. And so that might mean that, you know, you have to make adjustments, as Melissa said, in your tier 1 services that you give everybody. So I think that will be what you'll be thinking of when you get the results from your screening in the fall.
Yeah. Okay, so let's shift into dyslexia. So Leandra, can you tell us a little bit more about what dyslexia is? Because it's, you know, there's lots of different myths floating around about what it is, what it isn't. And can you once and for all definitively tell us, is it a medical diagnosis? Do you need a medical diagnosis for being identified with dyslexia?
Yeah. So yes, you are right. There are so many misconceptions of dyslexia. And I want to point out that in chapter 2 of the guidelines, they address many of these misconceptions about dyslexia, you know, about it being a visual issue, about reading backwards. So let me just start with the definition of dyslexia that is used by the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development and the International Dyslexia Association. And the slide that you have up on your screen here, we have bolded the words there for emphasis. These words are not in bold in the definition. So it is a specific learning disability, dyslexia is, that is neurobiological in origin. And I'm just going to pause there for a second to say that I think that that's where a lot of people have thought that when they see the word neurobiological, that a neurologist has to be involved. But what it's really referring to is that it is a brain-based way of reading, of approaching the reading task. And it's sort of clarifying for us that...
Oh, you muted yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's not an attitudinal issue for reading. It's not that the kid is, you know, quote unquote lazy or disinterested in reading. And so dyslexia is characterized by difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition. So it's that word level reading, and then by the poor spelling and decoding. And these difficulties typically result from this deficit in the phonological component of language that is unexpected in relation to all the child's other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. And as we said in the beginning, you know, gaps in ability to read and, you know, sort of those delays can cause these secondary consequences, such as, you know, reading comprehension, reduced reading experience, which in turn impedes the growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. So that is the definition of dyslexia, and nowhere does it say that it is a medical diagnosis. And in fact, if you look at all the issues that are highlighted in what dyslexia is, those all occur within a school setting. So it makes sense that the people who would know this and see those issues are the teachers in the school who would be able to recognize difficulties with accurate and fluent word recognition, with poor spelling and decoding. So it certainly is an issue that can occur in a school and can be identified by and recognized by people in the school.
So are schools diagnosing dyslexia, and can we use the term dyslexia during team meetings, you know, evaluations, instructional planning?
Well, definitely you can use the term dyslexia in the schools. And we have, besides, you know, reading the definition and seeing that great fit between what dyslexia is and the context of the school, the federal government and the state Department of Education have endorsed using the term dyslexia. And if you look on page 13 in the guidelines, it will talk about how an advisory was put out by the federal government back in 2015, sort of almost encouraging schools to use the term, because when you sort of name the issue and you explain the issue and everybody has this common understanding of what the student, how the student deals with the task of reading, then everybody knows, well, this is how we should intervene. So that it is actually in the best interests of the student to name it and use that term, especially throughout that whole IEP process.
Yeah, so I just want to reiterate, Leandra, you're saying that schools can now use the term dyslexia when they are, when a student meets the characteristics, and you would know a student meets the characteristics because you would refer back to the definition, which is basically difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition that are unexpected or despite like adequate instruction, basically. Yeah. Okay.
And you'd know this. You'd know this by having given assessments. So, it's not that you just, thinking, oh, the student made a couple of mistakes here and there or whatever. You're backing it up with the assessment.
Your performance on eligibility testing or comprehensive evaluation. And that's going to be a significant shift for many, many school districts. In fact, there are several places in the guidelines where there are voices of stakeholders. And one of the special education directors in the state, Allison Elmer, talks about how in her district, there had been a significant amount of reluctance around using the term dyslexia, and that, through professional development, through, reviewing national policies and national recommendations from OSERS, state level policies from DESE, and also just local permission and discussions that practitioners are now becoming more comfortable with using the term during meetings. And so it doesn't happen overnight. It's a process, it seems, that requires support for practitioners. Okay.
And the part of the support are these guidelines as well.
Great. So going back to some of the screening data, we also often get this question because there's so much energy just around screening. Like, what happens to the data? So screening is really only as effective as the entire MTSS process. It's one step within this larger process. And of course, the second step is data interpretation. This usually happens in a formal way at a data team meeting. And these are some of the recommendations in the guidelines around the interpretation piece, is that oftentimes grade level teams will meet and they will examine grade level data, or they'll examine classroom data, they'll sort the data, they'll examine composite scores. Some publishing companies, some screeners provide a composite score, which take all of the subscores together and tell you the student's overall level of risk, because not each subscore holds the same amount of predictive value for overall achievement. And that's just based on different, assessments. But really, the key goal of these data meetings is to answer 3 questions. The first question is, who is at risk? Based on their performance on the screening, who is at risk? How much risk are we talking? Some risk, significant risk, and in what areas? So this is allowing you to identify who and in what areas to plan your targeted instruction. And when you're looking at the different areas, what you can start to do is develop an instructional focus for students. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And then you can match students by their instructional focus. So this is really moving away from kind of like a one-size-fits-all model towards differentiated or targeted intervention. So,
Good slide, because that's exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah. So,
go ahead.
This is kind of a seamless process. We think of the area that we're screening. We think of, the targeted intervention area. And then we think of like, well, how would I know where to start with a student? And that's where some supplemental measures might come in. As we said, the screening protocols are often very quick. They're not going to give you a ton of information about where to start. They're just going to tell you who's at risk and how much risk and in what general area. So this is just an example. This is not comprehensive in terms of developing an instructional focus area. But for example, those students who score with some risk in their phonemic awareness based on their score on this phoneme segmentation tasks will require explicit systematic instruction in phonemic awareness. And in order to determine where to start, you might want to administer a phonemic awareness inventory to them. One example of that is The Past by David Kilpatrick. Whoops. If students struggle in any of the tasks that are related to the alphabetic principle, which is letter sound, so letter ID in kindergarten, letter sound in kindergarten, first grade, decoding tasks, then they'll need explicit systematic instruction in phonics. And you might want to give them some kind of phonics inventory to figure out where you should begin. Do they need to start with A, apple, ah, or do they have, skills intact and we can start kind of later in the progression of phonics skills? If students are, for example, scoring in the at-risk range on a measure of reading comprehension. So you'll notice that passage reading comprehension, reading and answering questions or in some way, shape, or form demonstrating comprehension about a passage is not administered until grade 2. That's when we're really expecting students to be able to make significant meaning out of what they're reading. In the absence of additional areas of risk, students who score in the at-risk range on measures of comprehension may need a focus on oral language. So that basically means, like, if they are not indicating that they have any risk in decoding or fluency, it's just the reading comprehension, then you might want to do some kind of additional survey of either reading comprehension that breaks down different comprehension tasks, or even listening comprehension, a measure of their ability to hear a story read to them and answer questions and see, is that an area of weakness as well that needs to be addressed? So we just talked about this, but in our school, we have a universal approach to tier 2. Everybody gets the same program. We have like a one size fits all. Either everybody gets phonics if they're struggling, or everybody gets some kind of fluency program or repeated reading program. Can we continue with that? Will that work for students who are at risk? And what we'll really say here is no, it won't work, because the targeted intervention, first of all, is really designed to rest on a robust, explicit, systematic instruction in tier 1 in the classroom. All students are going to receive classroom instruction. Tier 2 instruction is designed to provide a double dose of the classroom instruction. Usually it's the classroom instruction, but expanded or slowed down or additional practice. Tier 3 instruction is going to offer a specialized program that's more intensive, and that's usually for students who score with significant risk on screening tools. And you want to use your screening data to inform the tier of instruction or the type of instruction that a student is receiving. The whole point of measuring all of these different underlying component skills is to really identify in what areas children are struggling and target the intervention. This is all on page 44 of the guidelines. It goes into a lot of explanation about the different interventions. So, whoops.
I'll just say here, just a quick jump in, that the term MTSS is more or less synonymous with RTI. There are differences, but when we talk about MTSS, we're talking about that response to intervention model that people may be familiar with. MTSS is multi-tiered systems of support. So that whole idea of there being just different approaches for students at different times.
Yeah, thank you. And different systems in place, right? You have your assessment system, you have your intervention system, you have your core instruction. So for example, if you find the reason, again, coming back to this graphic that helps target or understand sort of how these different skills build upon each other in different domains of reading, if we look at the domain of accuracy and we say, for example, there's a student who has weaknesses at all the different levels in the domain of accuracy, they're struggling with phoneme segmentation, they're struggling with decoding, they're struggling with passage reading fluency, then it really helps us pinpoint the nature of the tier 2 instruction, that it should be focused and targeted towards building these accuracy skills. It might be something like a combination of phonics and phonemic awareness, and maybe some fluency work as well. So again, just to review, tier 1 is the classroom instruction. All students receive core classroom instruction. And interventions are only as strong as your classroom instruction. Classroom instruction needs to be robust, systematic, explicit. The Massachusetts Literacy Guide has lots of amazing resources about classroom instruction. If you're, as a district, really evaluating the efficacy of your classroom instruction, there are great objective tools that you can use to evaluate your classroom instruction, ensure it has all kind of the recommended components. And again, that might be a part of a strategic plan or questions that a literacy committee is addressing. But all students should receive core classroom instruction, plus those students who are indicating some risk receive usually tier 2 instruction. And that's going to be targeted to the area of weakness, and it's going to extend or expand from the core instruction. Other students who indicate more significant risk may need more intensive support and can receive tier 3 instruction. And this might be a specialized program. So for example, for those of you who know kind of different programs, if I'm just going to use an example, let's imagine you have, I don't know, a first grader who indicates some risk with tier 2 in phonemic awareness. Then they might get the tier 2 intervention would be an expansion of the core phonemic awareness program. And they might get just like, 10 or 15 minutes a day of some additional work. A tier 3, for those students who are scoring insignificant risk on phonemic awareness, they might get a program like LIPS, which is a more specialized phonemic awareness program through Linda Mood Bell. One group of students that you want to pay particular attention to, especially in terms of tier 3, are those students who score at the 5th percentile or lower. There's been research to show that first graders who score at the 5th percentile or lower on screening measures, so you might have to calculate what that raw score would be. For example, on a phonemic awareness task, if the benchmark is 100, and a student would have to score 100 to have no risk, then a student who scores a 5 or lower at the 5th percentile or lower would be in this kind of special group of students who benefit from getting tier 3 right away, not having to go from tier 2 into tier 3, but just going directly to tier 3. And this is a shift for some districts, this idea of using specialized programs with general education students. There was kind of an idea that sometimes you needed to save these specialized programs, or they were only appropriate for children in special education, but that is no longer the case. Tiers are thought of as being fluid. That's outlined really nicely in the MTSS blueprint for Massachusetts, which is available on the DESE website, page 9, that children can move fluidly throughout the tiers, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and that some children in particular, those scoring at the 5th percentile or below, will benefit from that tier 3 instruction in addition to the tier 1 right away. Okay.
So I think, Melissa, let's just address this issue of, so when do we do a referral?
Okay, so
Okay.
here's this, maybe this is a good thing to look at, this idea of the cycle, right? So here's a way to think about a data cycle. And this is a slightly different graphic than what's in the dyslexia guidelines, but I think it gives you some good information. So at the beginning of the year, you administer an initial benchmark or a screening assessment. You've chosen your tool. Let's say your tool is FastBridge or whatever, and you administer your initial assessment. You collect all of your data, you have your data team meeting, and at the data team meeting, again, you're answering these questions: who is at risk, how much risk, and in what areas. You're thinking about the instructional focus areas, you're grouping students, and then you start to deliver your instruction. All kids get tier 1. Some students will get tier 1 plus tier 2. Some students will get tier 1 plus tier 3. And you're progress monitoring. So now you start progress monitoring your students about every 1 to 3 weeks. You're administering your progress monitoring measure. You're collecting data on how their skills are growing for those students who are getting some kind of intervention. There may also be a group of students that you decide not to put into intervention. Maybe they were on the border in terms of their risk level, and you say, I'm just going to progress monitor them and see if they really need intervention or if they just didn't understand the task or what have you. Okay. Then you have a formal meeting to discuss the progress monitoring data. And this is something that some districts do, some districts don't. I highly recommend it. It's going to come about, let me just populate this. It's going to come about 8 to 10 weeks after your initial benchmark. So you have your initial benchmark maybe mid-September, then you have your progress monitoring meeting, usually around Thanksgiving or so. This is a formal meeting, grade level meeting, to talk about how students are doing with their progress monitoring. Do we need to adjust the intensity for some students? Do we need to adjust the grouping? Do we need to move some students from tier 3 down to tier 2? They're doing great, and I don't think they need this specialized instruction. They're tier 2 into tier 1. They've met the benchmark 3 times in a row. I think they're set. Whatever you think. And then again, you go into your mid-year benchmark assessment and you have your data team meeting. So each of these periods, from initial assessment to progress monitoring meeting, is one data cycle, and then progress monitoring meeting to second data meeting. That's a second data cycle. Now, referrals can happen at any time during this process. An MTSS process is not designed to delay or deny a referral. If there are concerns from the team, from parents, then a referral for eligibility testing can happen at any time. But also, the research shows that by the time this second data cycle has occurred, about 20 weeks have transpired since the beginning of school. And that tends to be a good initial period of time to see if the interventions are working effectively. In the research, it shows that, that period of time is usually adequate for determining if the students are responding to instruction, responding to intervention, that RTI has been effective. Is that what you're thinking, Leandra?
Yes. I just wanted to make sure that we put in there that referral for eligibility can occur at any time from parents, caregivers, or educators who might have a concern.
Right.
So that's just really important to bear in mind.
Okay, and so now we go into how intervention, how do we know intervention is sufficiently effective? Do you want to talk about this, Leandra?
Sure. So, you don't want to just be putting a child into an intervention group in perpetuity. You want to know, is the instruction you're giving them making a difference? So you want to be able to give some brief measures, quite frequently, every 1 to 3 weeks, that you're going to capture these incremental changes in growth. And you want to do it in this sort of criterion or norm-based way so that you're measuring it against a large sample of students.
Yeah.
And you want to gather at least 3 data points, and you want to plot them on an aim line. So if you can go to the next slide, Melissa.
Okay.
that gives an example of what it looks like. So it's really important to have these two lines on your graph. The red line is the goal line, which is determined by, what is the expected progress by the end of the year. And then you plot, in the blue here, you plot the student's achievement. And you can see, so even though there might have been in the first, 8 to 10 weeks, and a pretty upward trend for the student had not actually reached that goal line. So it's telling you, yes, they're moving, but not sufficiently to make that adequate progress. So you're going to have to make some of those changes that Melissa spoke about at the data team meeting until you eventually get to that point. If you look there around about week 18, week 19, all those changes have actually brought our student sort of above the goal line. So really important to have those two lines to help you make your decisions.
There are some data systems that do that for you, that will plot aim lines for you. They'll tell you about the rates of growth if a student's making, meaningful growth or ambitious growth or less significant growth. And one thing I really can't reiterate enough is the importance of a formal progress monitoring meetings, putting that on your calendar. I think alternatively, what tends to happen is educators, we want to fix things right away. We want to solve it. So if it seems as though a student's not making progress, we'll start changing things. We'll start pulling in this or pushing in that or shifting things around. And for especially some of our youngest students in kindergarten, first, second grade, they really need to adjust to the routine. They really need to understand what the expectation is so that the actual tasks kind of fall away and the content is what they're focusing on. So giving yourself that opportunity to just stay the course, give them a dose of course, bearing any extreme, needs or crises, and decide, okay, at the progress monitoring meeting, that's when I'm going to evaluate what changes need to be made. So I think that can be very helpful. All right. So, do you want to just talk about this, Leandra?
Yeah. So this is from research that shows, and it's cited in the guidelines, is that you can make significant gains in those first 15 to 20 hours of instruction if your instruction has been systematic in phonemic awareness to the advanced level, you've given systematic instruction in phonics, and you've given opportunities to practice reading in connected text. So if you have those characteristics in your instruction, you can make these significant gains in those 15 to 20 hours. And 15 to 20 hours, roughly, if you try and think about how does that play out in a school schedule, that's 30 minutes, 3 times a week for about 10 to 13 weeks.
Yeah. And of course, this is for students for whom this type of instruction would be appropriate based on their screening. And, one thing we would say is that there's a lot of energy and excitement around screening, but progress monitoring is just as important as screening. All of these different components of the MTSS model are really essential. And that's why we're talking about this. If you're thinking like, well, I don't know what to do if my student's not making meaningful progress, how do I increase their achievement? And again, this is a tool. This chart is a great resource. It's on page 57, and it talks about the different questions you can be asking yourself, the team can be asking to really ensure that that the intervention is effective, sufficiently robust, matched to their nature of weaknesses, etc. So I just want to point that out. I'm going to keep going because we're on slide 46 of 56, and I think we want to get through 10 slides in 5 minutes. All right, so let's see if we can do it, Leandra. All right, so Leandra, when does the student get an IEP? When do they get an individualized education plan?
So this comes after a child has been referred for that eligibility testing. And as we mentioned before, through the you know, it happens through the child find process, you know, and the screening and identification right in the beginning, or parent, guardian, educators, caregivers can refer a student at any time. Also, just to note that if a child has come up through the early intervention program, you know, before they've entered, like the early intervention is sort of birth to 3, those referrals happen, it's sort of spelled out for you there. They go through the eligibility testing, which requires, as Melissa said, a much more in-depth look through standardized assessments of the whole nature of their reading skills and their learning style, their learning profile.
Yeah. So speaking of that, do you want to just talk a little bit about kind of what kind of assessments should be involved in a comprehensive evaluation when a specific learning disability in reading is suspected?
So once again, you know, using the same framework that we understand that reading occurs at all these levels, the sublexical, lexical, connected text in the different domains, that's when we use these standardized tests that you may be familiar with. The CTOP will look at those aspects of phonological processing. You'll have timed tests like the Tower and some language tests, and, you know, just to make sure that you're looking at all these skills in all the domains.
Yeah,
we'll give you that full picture.
Right, and this is not comprehensive, but these are just some additional assessments that you might want to include in addition to kind of the typical achievement test or intelligence testing.
So I think that, you know, Melissa, we are getting close to the end here. And I think to reiterate is that these guidelines are for the sort of the screening.
Right.
They do discuss in a couple of the chapters towards the end, you know, what is the process for actual identification. So, and that is a really complex process that is designed to ensure the rights of students, designed to ensure that students get what we call FAPE, you know, free and appropriate public education. So I don't want to give it short shrift here in this time.
Yeah.
So I would like, you know,
that could be another webinar. That could be a BT. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. So if you want to take action, if you're leaving this webinar and you're feeling energized, which we hope you are, because there's lots of good information, the first thing we would say is, you know, familiarize yourself with the guidelines and mass literacy. If you can, if you're a teacher or an educator, create a PLC to talk about these guidelines with your colleagues.
Professional learning community.
Professional learning community. Sorry, yeah. Maybe gather a literacy committee in your district if you feel like this is something that needs to be looked at over the course of different schools, different grade levels. Making change is not instantaneous. And so developing a strategic plan, and this is discussed in the guidelines, is something that usually is a process to develop the strategic plan. And the plan itself is usually over multiple years, at least 3, typically 3 to 5. So you can think about, you know, over the course of several years, what is our goals and how will we achieve those? And also to evaluate your current practices, your assessment practices, your instructional practices in terms of the guidelines can be a helpful objective for the literacy committee as well. So we're going to go ahead and take some questions now.
I will just say one thing about that strategic plan. I mean, one of the great things is that it also gives your district that sort of, you put out that plan and then you are transparent for everybody in the district, for the parents, about what steps you are taking to refine the practice to improve outcomes for everybody. Yeah. So that is a very valuable piece, and these guidelines help you get to that point. Okay, so with lots of questions. There were very specific questions about some of the assessments.
So what we would say is so there was one thing that says our district uses Brigance for screening all K students. Does Brigance include dyslexia screening? So we don't know every assessment backwards and forwards, but what you can do is you can take, again, those set of characteristics that are outlined at each grade level, and you can look at your assessment tool that's currently in place and you can say, does this assessment tool measure phoneme segmentation, for example? Does it measure decoding at these time points? Do we have to supplement, or do we feel like this assessment is not giving us the information that we need? Maybe we're just going to replace the assessment altogether. So those, really specifying the different tasks at each grade level are designed to ensure that you can evaluate your tools in terms of that information. So Andrew asked, can we talk more about why kindergarten students are only screened twice a year rather than 3 times? That's a very good question, Andrew. And there is an explanation in chapter 4 of the guidelines.
And it's not just because we don't want to be too aggressive to our kindergarten students.
It's because of something called a floor effect, where it looks like many children are too many children are at risk, basically. And so, and it's not helpful in terms of really this differentiation between who's at risk and who isn't. And what some of the research found is that there was no distinction between screening 3 times versus screening twice. That being said, if you have concerns, you will want to think about what your core instruction looks like in kindergarten in literacy and ensure that it's sufficiently robust so that kids are getting a lot of good instruction regardless of the screening process that's happening in the first half of the year for kindergarten.
Melissa, we had a question. What's the suggestion for screening of an intervention for older students who may have been missed?
Yeah.
This guidance is just, for, the screening guidelines are for K through 2.
Right. So, screening is really designed for students who have not had their full kind of course of reading instruction. It's really to decide, who, before they've received all of the formal reading instruction, who's at risk given these predictive skills. So when we're talking about a student at 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, or even into middle school who is suspected either by the family or by the team of not meeting grade level expectations, then we're really getting more into a question of an evaluation and trying to determine, what's the instruction look like for the student? What has their performance been on benchmark measures that the district is using? What skills do those benchmark measures assess? Is there any way to assess some of those like lexical or sublexical skills with benchmark measures? I'm thinking of something like the DIBELS, which is free and available through the University of Oregon, and that looks at single word reading through 3rd or 4th grade. So you could look at that as well. But it really, at that point, becomes more of a measure of how they're performing on benchmarks and referral for eligibility. Yeah. There's a question about a 1st or a 2nd grader, Terry asked this, who performed poorly on the rapid naming subtest at the beginning of the year. Would it make sense to screen them again with RAN? So I'm going to say with RAN, you're not progress monitoring with RAN, and that is clearly stipulated in the guidelines as well. RAN is it's like an indicator of risk. The RAN task asks students to look at an object and name them. And there's no real value in reading achievement of looking at like an object like star, chair, dog, or a symbol like a letter, B, S, A. There's no value in reading. It's just telling us, it's giving us a little insight into the circuit in the brain that will later be used for reading fluency. And if it takes a student a while, or if they're slow in just naming a letter or just naming an object, then they're vulnerable to being slow when they're reading, to not developing reading fluency at the same rate of their peers. And that's why we use that as an early indicator. So if you think that the RAN task, like they weren't paying attention, I know with kindergartners especially, they couldn't, start talking to you in the middle of the task and just get, they don't really understand what they're being asked to do. If you think that there was something faulty in the administration, you certainly can re-administer it, and there's no learning effect that happens there. You're not going to invalidate a score, but you're not looking at RAN as an outcome measure. What you're looking at is their overall reading automaticity as an outcome measure. Somebody asked if they could use the RAN subtest on the CTOP as their district's measure for RAN. Yes, you certainly can. You can use the RAN subtest on the CTOP. You can use the RAN subtest for the RAN-RAS. These are standardized assessments, but you're not using them for eligibility purposes and screening. You're using them for screening purposes, and they're valid tools.
And I will say that the science has informed some of the products that are out in the market that you're going to see coming out in the market. So you are going to see publishers produce some RAN assessments from the awareness that it is a crucial indicator.
Yeah.
So, and I would just urge everybody just to be, use those criteria for what makes a good screening tool, that it's valid, reliable, it's being, norm referenced or criterion referenced, be that good consumer of products to evaluate the tools that are on the market.
Yeah. Caroline said, what if you're told it isn't dyslexia, but you get a diagnosis of a specific learning disability and reading fluency? Specific learning disorder and reading fluency might be in the DSM, but it isn't, using a more well-known accessible term, helpful. So I think that that's a good question. I think when you're having your conversation with the team about whether or not, a child meets the characteristics for dyslexia, now you have that definition kind of at your fingertips. And really the definition is difficulties with accurate and or fluent word reading. So and there are cases in which children have a specific learning disability in reading, but it's not dyslexia. And I'll say that that's usually when it's really just related to comprehension, that the student's accuracy is typical for their age or grade, their reading fluency is typical for their age or grade, but they still struggle with answering comprehension questions. And most often you'll also see those difficulties arise with listening comprehension, that it's just difficult for the child to organize the information, keep track of it, answer questions, engage in analysis. Oh, wow, there's a big picture of us.
Well, I think, yeah.
Yeah, so I think that having that discussion, my understanding of the definition of dyslexia is this: can you tell me more about why you think it's not dyslexia? And show me like the scores. I think that's a great way to really start, building communication and trying to better understand, the place that everyone is coming from.
I think we've got two questions, and the one, Melissa, is based on this communication. As a parent, what questions should we be asking our district to make sure we know our children are getting their proper screenings and, the interventions?
Yeah. I mean, I think that is right, that's opening a line of communication with districts about, what is your plan for screening for risk of dyslexia? What does, based on, I saw the guidelines came out. Can you tell me, how the district is practices aligned to these guidelines? And starting a conversation about that. Yeah.
How the district is refining their practices,
right,
based on the guidelines, which is what the guidelines intended to do.
Yeah.
If you could just share that last slide, Melissa, of our thank yous.
Oh yeah, let's share thank yous. Okay, sure.
for helping facilitate this.
Okay.
I'd also say that it's great for students with dyslexia to know that the guidelines are there, that they dispel myths about dyslexia, that they present the most common, the most up-to-date research, and that they also aim for this equity. And I think that is a big takeaway that we have for this, and that we'd like to, sort of end with as well.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks so much to the whole team from the Tisch College, Peter Levine, Jen McAndrew, Jessica Burns, Shane Lee, and Daniela. We really appreciate you facilitating this webinar and giving everyone a platform to discuss this really important issue. If you have kind of follow-up questions and you want to reach out to Leandra and I, you can reach out to us at our emails here through Crafting Minds. And yeah, we just hope that this is helpful. We hope that you find the guidelines helpful, and have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday, everyone.